Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Baragwi Pea Berry Lot 002 Wash Processed Kenya from the Picky Chemist. And there's the bag right there. And the Picky Chemist, based out of Chaudfontaine, Belgium. And this coffee was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video, where it finished 3rd place out of 4 Picky Chemist coffees on that day. This is also part 2 of our 4-part Picky Chemist series that will feature the 4 coffees from that blind taste test video. And if you watched that video, then you saw that I was able to pick this coffee out based off of the aroma alone, as it offered a very Kenyan-like aroma. However, that didn't necessarily translate to the cup, as it came out a little bit more tame than I think I was expecting. So it'll definitely be interesting to see if that remained a theme with this coffee, as this right here is day 50. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio. At warmer temps, we went 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. I did find a little bit more success with a little bit more fine of a grind on this one as well. Roast profile, this one's a little bit more well-defined, as this one is definitely on the lighter side of coffees. This one did feel pretty light by most standards and metrics. Felt a little bit lighter than the Costa Rican coffee we'd reviewed, but still not necessarily maybe to the same extent as some of the super light coffees. So still very light by most standards and metrics. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 31, blind taste test day and the first impression, and it did initially start a little bit Kenyan forward in terms of the sweeter tart berry currant aspects to the cup, but also a well-defined lime citric component to it as well. Some other factors I was able to pick up from this one was a slight pastry sweetness, as well as a fair bit, I want to say a very slight bit actually, of the savory herbal aspect as it did cool down. I did mention that in the video that I was able to pick up a very slight savory component, but for the most part the coffee was a little bit more tame than I think I was expecting, even in terms of the savory aspect. So it was an interesting first impression. We continue on to day 33 as I ran it through the Chemex, and it wasn't necessarily overly interesting for a Kenyan coffee, as it seemed to be lacking a lot of the strong Kenyan aspects that I've come to expect from Kenyan coffees in general. If anything, it was a slightly more delicate representation of the berries and citrus, all in a little bit more moderation, as opposed to the, well, very strong brightness that you typically experience from Kenyan coffees. It could have also been the brew method that we were using, but the second impression didn't necessarily yield what I was expecting from the cup either. So we continue on to day 36 as I ran it through the April brewer. And once again, the cup continues to come out a little bit more moderately tame than I think I might have expected. A lot of the sweetness was a little bit more subtle, and it was a little bit more reminiscent of, once again, I described it as that pastry sweetness. But I couldn't help but shake the feelings of marshmallows, as it continued to taste a little like marshmallows to me. Slight floral herbality with a relative moderate brightness for Kenyan coffees. So once again, with the Costa Rican, I said that there was an expectation for it, and it kind of bucked the trend for the expectation. This one definitely had an expectation, especially given the roast profile of this coffee, to have a lot of brightness, but relative to a lighter profiled Kenyan coffee, this one didn't necessarily have the sort of brightness I might have expected. So that in itself was interesting, but we continue on to day 38, where I did make the adjustments, higher temp, more fine grind, this time through the Chemex, and there were slight positives that could be found with these adjustments, as it was still relatively tame for a Kenyan coffee, but it did offer very nice balance, as it wasn't skewing too heavily in one specific direction. It's bright, not overly bright, berry-like in moderation, with the citrus backing that in the cup. Unique in that sense, given that it's just a little bit more even in general. That's something I said with the Costa Rican coffee is, there's going to be a little bit of a theme with these Picky Chemist coffees. They just seem to come out a little bit more even. Day 40, best day of the coffee, and this is when I did make those adjustments with the V60, a little bit more fine of a grind at higher temperatures, and there's a little bit more of that pastry sweetness, that slight marshmallow that I had mentioned in earlier days. A little less even, but it was worth it for the added vibrancy that was coming from the cup, as it had the most brightness by far. And this is a weird thing for me to say, I was kind of missing the brightness from the Kenyan coffee, because I actually kind of wanted to experience that from this one. A little bit more well-defined of a citric lime, darker berry component. It was trending in a positive direction. Day 43, same adjustments to the Chemex once again, and the cup continued to remain pretty even, so I don't necessarily think that that was an ideal brew method for this coffee, given that the coffee was a little bit more tame to begin with, so that wasn't helping. there isn't much unique to really point out about it, as the sweetness is just a little bit more even in general with the entirety of the cup. Was going to stick to the V60 for this one, and day 45 went back to the V60, and even with the adjustments to the cup, relatively speaking, it just continued to remain a little bit more tame. And once again, it's interesting that I did receive these coffees at day 31. And a lot of people say that I start my coffees a little too early, even at the day 14 mark. But the reason I do it is to kind of experience a change, because I do imagine that this coffee wasn't going to be the same at the day 14 mark, no matter which direction it was going in, than it would be here on this day 45 mark. But I really wanted to maybe try these coffees a little earlier to see if it's just the way that these coffees are, if they continue to remain consistent and even throughout the entire time you're drinking them, or if on the earlier days you might be experiencing more vibrancy, maybe even less vibrancy. It's just kind of an interesting thing to me that I wish I could have experienced to maybe gain a better picture representation of these coffees. Even then, clean, base, relatively delicate for a Kenyan yet again. Most defined aspect on this day was the citrus with a little bit more of those moderate to dark berry components to it. Day 47, final notes, we have same adjustments, higher temperatures, more fine grind, and it continues to be the most vibrant it has been, but even then it's still moderate in terms of expectations. Very clean cup relative, once again, to the Kenyan coffee. So I say a lot of these things keeping in mind that I have an impression of Kenyan coffees, especially lighter profiled Kenyan coffees, that this one was just a little bit against. In addition to that, a slight floral herbality, yet again, that hibiscus component I experienced from a lot of Kenyan coffees present in this cup on this day. But that's just kind of the final notes I have for this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those. And we'll start with the cleanliness, level 4. I always say that when it comes to Kenyan coffees and you do score a level 4 in terms of the cleanliness, it will be one of my more enjoyable Kenyan coffees. So credit there at the very least, because this one did come out very clean. There wasn't an overly strong savoriness to the cup. I actually haven't really discussed the savoriness throughout the entire time we've talked about this coffee, because it wasn't something I experienced. So it was definitely lacking in terms of that tomato aspect. Even in that first impression where I did experience, it was very slight. And throughout the entire time, it's not something that I really noticed, given the coffee was just kind of more tame and delicate in general. Finish, level 4. Lower side of the level 4, I do have to say, it still had a fair bit of that Kenyan brightness, but I've always said it would be really surprising if a Kenyan coffee didn't reach a level 4 in terms of the finish. This one actually barely reached a level 4, so that in itself was surprising. Sweetness, level 4, even with a little bit more tame of a cup, this is on the lower side of level 4. A lot of these are on the lower side of level 4, and that's something I really wanted to point out in this tasting wheel. But I feel like there was just enough sweetness to push it over the top. That slight pastry sweetness, that slight marshmallow sweetness, and even a slight fruit sweetness to the cup did push it over that threshold. But if anything, higher side of the level 3, lower side of the level 4, not necessarily the sweetest coffee, especially from the 4 that we are reviewing in this series. Acidity, level 4, once again, it's on the slightly lower side of the level 4. It didn't have the same sort of Kenyan brightness I was expecting. So while it did reach that mark, again, it barely reached that mark. I think the reason I wanted to put it there was because some of the other coffees that we are reviewing from the Picky Chemist didn't warrant or justify that level 4. So this one being a little bit more bright than those ones is probably the reason it pushed it all the way up to that level 4. Citrus fruit, level 4. Yes, I think that the most well-defined fruit aspect within this coffee, and maybe flavor profile all around, was the lime, because the lime was quite well-defined within this cup, and as a result, the citric quality to the cup in general was the most distinct and pronounced thing I was experiencing from it. So that justifies that level 4. Then we have a bunch of level 3s. We'll start with the body, level 3. It is a Kenyan coffee. I did go with the V60, fully expected to have at least a minimum of the medium body to the cup, so don't have too much to say on that. Florality, level 3. Towards the end, I was experiencing maybe a little bit more of that kind of red herbality, that hibiscus-like component to the cup, so that was there for me. Berry fruit, level 3. Yes, I think that's the other thing, is I'm so used to these Kenyan coffees having a very strong, bright, tart berry aspect to it. But given that the brightness wasn't that strong, the sweetness wasn't that strong, and the berry wasn't quite as well defined as the citrus, it actually goes down a little lower for me at that level 3 mark. And then I think the last thing really worth discussing is the savoriness at that level 2 mark, because as I've kind of said, I fully expect a lot of these Kenyan coffees to typically reach a minimum level 3, but this one didn't have it throughout the entire time. No matter what adjustment I made, it continued to remain very even, consistent, and just a little bit more tame, especially in that aspect. So not a whole lot of savoriness, not a whole lot of that tomato-like component to this one, so that's a nice positive to it. So on paper, I think looking at this tasting wheel, it's something that I would have really enjoyed, but I think you must kind of take this tasting wheel with a grain of salt, that a lot of these things are on the slightly lower side of the marks that they received, but I do think it's a pretty accurate representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, it's kind of mixed because this one did end up being my second favorite of the 4 coffees in this series, but I actually did end up missing a lot of the Kenyan attributes that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of. I just really wanted to kind of experience them in abundance, and I think with such expectations that I would receive them from this coffee in pretty significant abundance. If anything, I was a little bit more worried that this coffee might be a little too bright. It might skew a little too heavy in the direction that I didn't necessarily expect when I first made the entire purchase for this order. That's not what happened with this coffee. And it continued to remain, as I've said with the Costa Rican, it's a very even coffee and it bucks a lot of the trends. It's a little cleaner, and that's a positive. I think if anybody would have said to me, hey, you're going to score a level 4 in the cleanliness, you're going to score a level 4 in the sweetness for a Kenyan coffee, and it's going to have little to no tomato, I would have said it's going to be one of my more enjoyable Kenyan coffees I've experienced. But this one wasn't necessarily there. I think just maybe the relative tame aspect of this coffee was something that was a little surprising to me, and I just wish I could have gotten more from this one. Even with some pretty strong adjustments, it just continued to remain more moderate, more tame, and once again, that's been the theme with the first 2 coffees that we've reviewed from them up to this point. Now, the type of person I would suggest this coffee to, first and foremost, I will go with somebody that doesn't like the savory aspect of these Kenyan coffees, because this one has little to none of it. It's probably one of the Kenyan coffees we've reviewed this year that has maybe the least of that in general. While it still offers a fair bit of the Kenyan aspects, I mean, I picked up this coffee and I was able to tell from the first impression that it was a Kenyan coffee. So it still is a Kenyan coffee. You can definitely still tell it's a Kenyan coffee. And it still offers the citrus, the berries, and a fair bit of the brightness as well, and some of that florality, but maybe a little bit more moderate, maybe a little bit more tame and an even of a sense. So that could be a really nice selling point to somebody and a really nice positive to this one, while still offering some unique sweet attributes to it as well. But for the most part, I think that's just kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Baragwi Pea Berry, Lot 002, Wash Processed Kenya from the Picky Chemist. Thank you for watching.